In 1998, Chris Jericho was on his way up as a top mid-card talent on the WCW roster, while it was almost impossible to break through to a main event spot in what was probably the most stacked roster in wrestling history. Jericho was extremely motivated to stand out of the usual mid-card cruiserweight division, who were mostly involved in wrestling matches and between the hyped star power segments that the shows were built around. Jericho was constantly pitching ideas to management, knowing that wrestling matches wouldn't take him to the next level. From that point, Jericho was involved in a series of entertaining skits and segments that separated him from the crew, going to different locations and coming up with ideas to showcase his charisma and character development. The next step was supposed to come in the fall of '98. Jericho, in a comedic heel role, was constantly mocking the company's top star Bill Goldberg on the weekly television shows, in an attempt to lure him into work an angle that will take him to the next level. Calling him Greenberg, in reference to him being just a year into his TV career, imitating his entrance, and claiming to have a winning streak over him. Jericho was basically shooting his own angle, as Goldberg was never part of any of it, nor was notified on any future plan to work with Chris. The Sharks in the locker room were starting to work as reportedly, Nash & Co. were advising Goldberg not to feud with Jericho as he was too small and in a mid-card position, as it would devalue him to work in a comedic angle as the company's top draw who was built as an unstoppable monster. Goldberg, along with President Eric Bischoff, shot down an idea for a pay-per-view match between them. The payoff for the entire one-sided program happened on November 9, with Goldberg spearing Jericho after he called him out in a promo segment. Goldberg continued his record-breaking run with WCW at the peak of their popularity, with him as one of the main factors for the success. Jericho left for the WWF less than a year later, becoming one of the biggest stars of the generation. Fast forward to July 2020, Chris Jericho is now in Goldberg's position as the leading star of his company. While the situations are not even worth the comparison, as AEW is a small niche company with a talent roster that doesn't have a single difference maker, along with the out-of-touch Dynamite product losing half its audience within weeks of being on television. Even as it is pretty much by default, Chris Jericho's value far surpassed anyone else on the roster, as he's the only recognizable name to the mass audience. For the first 6 months of the program, Jericho was by far the biggest viewership gainer on Dynamite, boosting numbers weekly on the show with an extremely negative ratings pattern, as they were usually peaking at the start and losing viewers' interest in every quarter. Jericho lost his title to Jon Moxley and moved on. What happened next was Jericho, with creative control over his character, basically got bored. From that point, from a top main event heel, he did a 180, turning into a cartoon character, talking to drones and feuding with indie comedy acts. While Orange Cassidy 2020 and Chris Jericho 1998 are leagues apart, as Jericho was a legit talent on the way up in the era of the greatest talent in history, while Cassidy is a niche indie act that would never get close to being hired in different times along with the vast majority of performers in today's industry. The result was Jericho, who was adamant on the fact that he would not do what others did in the past and work with anyone on the roster. Instead of elevating others, seemingly damaged himself, ending up indirectly proving them right. 22 years later, Jericho went from a guaranteed viewership gainer, to a normal turn-off segment of the show like the rest of the roster, completely devaluing himself as the top drawing performer. While Jericho is still not at the level of the almost unprecedented viewership losers like the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega, who are rejected by the audience on a weekly basis and at the top of the list as individual turn-offs on the show, Jericho got to the point that even a highly promoted segment with Mike Tyson ended up losing viewers. Jericho's goal as the biggest star and best performer in the company was to attempt to pull them up from their indie habits, facing an almost impossible job as the show is written by clueless, inexperienced Tony Khan, who evidently has no idea how to write and format a successful show. Now, less than a year into his run, while still not an unsolvable situation, it seems like Jericho gave up and let them drown in the indie sewerage.